Hey guys, I'm CG Smoothie and welcome to the quick intro to Unity. How to set up a project and get started in development for Unity. This tutorial should be for very beginners. It won't cover any code and it'll just get you familiar with how to actually interact with the editor itself and how making games even works in this game engine. What are you going to need to start out with Unity? You're going to need a computer pre-installed with Unity Hub and a version of Unity. You can get Unity Hub from Unity's website, unity.com/download, and then you can just download Unity here. I already have it, so I'm not going to do that. Then you're going to need to install a version of Unity. I'm going to just use 2021.3.4 because I personally don't like the newer versions of Unity. I think they can be a little buggy sometimes. But if you have anything semi-recent or even from 2019 on, this tutorial should apply for you also. We won't be using it in this tutorial, but Microsoft Visual Studio is also very important to Unity development because Unity uses the C# language to use all of its coding, and especially add the Unity specific libraries to Visual Studio so that it can use IntelliSense and autocomplete, which will make it way easier for you to code. Let's create our first Unity project. You just go here and click New Project, and make sure you're using your editor, the one that you want to use for this project. Since I said I'll be using 2021.3.6. And then choose which type of game you want to make. You can do 2D or 3D. This can change at any time. You can switch it from 3D to 2D just by installing some add-ons called packages in the Unity Package Manager. I'm just going to use 3D for the sake of this tutorial. And then there's also the different render pipelines. Universal Render Pipeline uses different ways to use shaders, but because we're just going to use the basic bare bones of Unity, I will be using the built-in render pipeline, which is much easier for beginners to learn. And you can also switch between these render pipelines at any time using those packages I mentioned earlier. So then when you want to make a project, you just name your project and decide where it's going to be. And if you're using the Unity Cloud, what user is in charge of it. But I'm not going to be using the Unity Cloud for this. And I already have a project ready because it will take a couple minutes. So here we go. We are now in a new Unity project. So there's a lot of different views in a Unity project, and you probably don't have any idea what any of these mean if you're a very beginner. So the scene view right here is what is in the game, but not necessarily what is seen within the camera. What is seen within the camera, it will be in the game view. So to maneuver around in the scene view, you're going to want to right click to rotate the camera, scroll wheel to zoom the camera, left click to select things, scroll wheel button to pan the camera, right click and WASD to free cam around. It makes more sense if we're not in isometric perspective. And then also this little gimbal makes it easier to orient yourself throughout the scene and also change perspectives of the camera. The hierarchy is where all of the objects in the scene will be easily listed and selectable. You can see in the default scene, you should have a camera and a directional light, which we do here. And you can see when you select something in the hierarchy, it also selects it in the scene with this gizmo that lets you drag and stuff around. The inspector, which is this little panel here, is where you can see the details of the object you currently have selected in the hierarchy and scene view. So we have the camera here, and you can see it has a transform, camera, and audio listener. And then the project shows all the assets you have in your project. Currently, it should just have a scene folder with your empty scene. Let's go back to the hierarchy. Right-click in the hierarchy and create a cube by going to 3D Object, Cube. This should auto-select the cube for you. In the inspector, it should also show the cube's properties. which should contain a transform, a mesh filter, a mesh renderer, and a box collider. These are called components. Components are what you're going to use to create mechanics in your Unity projects. You can create your own custom components through coding them in C#, but for now we will stick to the default built-in components. The transform component holds all the position, rotation, and scale of the game object. In case your cube was spawned in a weird position, like mine was, right-click on its transform component and click reset, and that will bring it back to the origin and scale it back to its default scale, which should be 1. Let's then call this cube ground by clicking the text field above the transform component and calling it ground. I'm going to scale this up now and lower it on the y-axis so that we can add another object to use as a physics object. So I'm just going to scale it up on the x and z by like 5. Let's go 10. And then bring it down on the y to like -5. Now I'm going to add another object, this time a sphere. Again, we're going to go in the hierarchy, right-click, 3D object, sphere, and then reset the transform again. I'm going to scale it up by 2 on every axis. So now we have a little sphere above a cube. Now we're going to add a component to this sphere. Let's go down here to add component and add a rigid body. This is what you're going to add if you want any physics to actually happen on this object, like gravity or adding force through a script or through another collider. Now, if we go into the game view and press play, the sphere should collide with the box. And it does. This is only possible if both objects have a collider on them, as they do here with a sphere collider and a box collider. If you see we turn off the box collider, the sphere clips through the box. These two colliders are both collider objects, which means they have largely the same use, just have a different shape. So in code, they will have a lot of the same events that you can trigger them with, but because they're a different shape, you have to use a different component on them. Because if you use a sphere collider on this box, it will not be as tightly constrained. It wouldn't really work. We can do some fun things now by selecting the cube and dragging it up. Let's also split the game view so it's there. While play mode is active, so it can add like a little ping pong. Isn't that fun? And if the sphere rolls off or clips through the cube in the game view, we can just press play again and it will revert to what it was before you pressed play. That was pretty cool, but it looked pretty boring. Let's try to make the sphere and cube look more interesting. In the project, go to Assets and right-click and create Material. This is going to be how we change the material of each object. We're going to call this red and change the albedo, which is the color and texture if you apply a texture. And we're just going to give the sphere the material, so now it's red. And you do that by dragging the material on or by selecting the sphere and changing the material to red. This material can also be changed in real time, because if we change the metallicness, it also changes the metallicness of the object in the game. And sphere, or the smoothness, makes it shinier. We're going to keep it pretty not shiny. We're just going to revert it back to normal. I think it was at 0.5. And then let's do another one by clicking this and pressing Ctrl D, which duplicates, and renaming it, which you can do by F2 or just by right-clicking and clicking rename. And we're going to call this one blue. And we can change that one to a shade of blue and put that on the cube. Now they both have their own material, and we can do that again. Now that we've made this, let's try to make an actual game. And we're gonna make Plinko. If you've ever played in a carnival, we're gonna make a new scene by doing in the assets, scenes, right click, create scene. And we're gonna call this Plinko. Now if we double click on this and save this old scene, we're in a new scene again. It should look exactly how the old scene looked before we did anything. Let's make a peg by creating a new 3D object, this time a capsule. And this is like a little pill-shaped guy. We're going to also reset its transform. And rotating it a little on the X to 90. And then we're going to duplicate this by clicking it and Control D, which duplicates it. I'm also going to make it so that we're in the view that will be head on. And then just dragging these out to make a Plinko board. And you can select multiple of them and duplicate them all at once by doing shift click in the inspector, or shift click, or just box selecting in the scene view. And we're going to keep doing this until we have an entire board. Okay, that seems like enough pegs for a board. So now let's create the walls for this board. We're going to right click, or actually, let's also make the capsules easier to see. We're going to call these pegs also. And then we're going to create empty parent so that they're all underneath one object, and we'll call that pegs. And then we can hide them all by doing that. Now we're going to create one cube and reset its transform and bring it back a little bit. Then we can scale it up on this axis. These tools, this is grab, this is rotate, this is scale, and then the other ones are more for UI, so we don't need to worry about that right now. And then we're also going to scale it out a little more, and then we're going to have to drag it this way. And then we're going to scale it out on this axis and bring it down. And that looks good. We're going to duplicate this one and put it in front of the pegs. And we're going to turn off the mesh renderer so that it still has a collider, but it won't be visible. Let's also color these pegs all at once by selecting all of them with shift click, going into project, clicking our red material and dragging it into the material slot, and now they're all red. Now let's just add 2 more walls by duplicating this, scaling this down, and bringing it to the side, and bringing another one to the other side. And then just one more for the very end, the very bottom. Maybe scaling them down a little more so that there can be like an empty space at the bottom. And we can do that to all of them by shift clicking them in the inspector, and also this one, and doing this. There we go. Now that we have that, we're also going to just give those walls a material by making this yellow. And applying it to them like we did with the pegs. yellow. Now we can add a Plinko puck by right-clicking. Well, let's also put these all as walls in a wall parent. And we're going to call this walls. And we can hide that as well. Now let's create a new 3D object and a cylinder. This will default use a capsule collider, but we don't actually want it to use a capsule collider. So we're going to remove this component and add a mesh collider. And that will be more accurate to the actual mesh. If you make it convex, you can see the shape of it. Like so. And then we're going to want to scale it out a bit. First, we're going to need to rotate it. And then scale it out, I would say 2 and 2. And then also scale it in. Let's turn on the mesh render just for a bit for this second wall, so we can get the actual scale of the walls here. And also bring up the puck so that it will be above the walls. And you can double click on something in the scene, in the hierarchy, so that it focuses the camera on it. And then let's scale it in a bit and bring it forward and scale it out a bit again. And also make sure that we scaled it by 2 again. Now we can turn off this mesh renderer again. And if we press play, we should just be able to see the puck fall once we add a rigid body. That should be good. And we might face a problem that we can fix in a second. As you can see, it might stick to some things. So what we want to do is create a physics material, which is like a material, except it only works for rigid bodies, and it decides how much friction there is and bounciness. So we're going to take out all the friction so that it doesn't stick to anything, and we're going to add some bounciness so that it will bounce. And then we're going to call that bounce, and we're going to add this to every single collider by putting it in the box collider in the collider's material section. And this will make it so that it doesn't get stuck to all the pegs. Now if we press play, the puck should fall. We might need to move the puck a little bit because it will not have... So we're going to move it left and right, and it should now fall like a real Plinko puck. We might have made it a little too bouncy, which we can edit in the bounce properties. Let's only do it 0.5 so that it doesn't have as much force going back up as it did falling down. And it fell there. What we could do, this is just going to be a very basic scripting, is we could add a little script called scoreboard or score. And we can create another box down here and turn off the mesh renderer and make it a trigger and attach this score as a component. This isn't, you don't have to do this. This is just to get your ideas flowing on how you could make your own game. In colliders, they have an event called onTriggerEnter. And if a trigger enters, we can just say debug.log, you got, and we'll make a public float score equals 10 plus score plus points. And in this, we could change the amount of score, but we'll just say 15, just to prove that it does a different thing. And then in the console, which is where output comes, when the cylinder falls into the trigger, it will say, you got 15 points. So that could just be an idea of how to get started on your games. And that's the basic intro to the Unity editor. This tutorial covered how to create your own game objects and how to add components, specifically physics-based components like colliders and rigid bodies, and how to change the materials of your game objects. I have other tutorials on how to get started in coding, like basic types of variables and methods that come packaged into Unity. So I'll link that here. That's going to be it for this tutorial. I will probably make more beginner Unity tutorials because I've noticed that's something people have asked for. And with that, I'll see you guys next time. Thanks so much for watching. Bye.